Good morning, everyone. The topic for our report and presentation is Advancing Electronic Commerce and Digital Trade between ASEAN and Canada. I'm Shane Dial, and with me today are my colleagues Edwin and Edou and Esther Ocheni. The purpose of our research is to accelerate digital trade for Canadian businesses in the ASEAN region. This is done through assessing trade barriers and establishing digital trade partnerships between Canada and the ASEAN region. And the time is now for Canada to seize the opportunity that presents itself in the ASEAN region. Next slide, please. As a brief overview, we will start with the background and introduction on digital trade, as well as our research process. This will be followed by introducing some of our key findings and barriers to trade. Our barriers to trade are split into two sections: domestics and structural barriers, as well as free trade agreement barriers. We have paired these key findings with recommendations from our interview analysis. Our four main recommendations to address these barriers are improving Canada's obscure national brand, increasing funding for ventures, increasing multilateral trade, and overcoming the spaghetti bowl effect, which we will go into more detail later. Our research and report has been completed for the CABC's Canadian-ASEAN Business Council, whose key goals are focused in three areas: education, advocacy, and networking. Canadian interest shifted to the ASEAN region due to the great opportunity it poses for the country. With an estimated GDP growth of 4.9% in 2019, ASEAN maintains as one of the fastest growing regional economies in the world. And altogether, ASEAN is the fifth largest economy in the world in terms of GDP. As I've already stated, we have a focus on digital trade, which is becoming a central theme to the future of trade negotiations. With the global economy rapidly digitizing, digital trade is at the forefront for many countries looking to recover from the pandemic-induced recession and expand into newer markets and boost economic growth. Due to the recent COVID-19 pandemic, businesses are moving communication and day-to-day operation online, and the acceleration of digital trade has become a primary focus in the global economy. Businesses have seen how a push towards digitization can create overall growth and a means to establish new footing in other areas around the globe, such as the ASEAN region. Next slide, please. The research that has been done by our team is supplemented by a series of qualitative interviews. Each interview featured questions on key components of digital trade, such as cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, fintech, FTAs and DTAs, pandemic response, and national branding. The interviews were done through a lens of Canada-ASEAN relations. Interview participants came from companies in a range of sectors such as artificial intelligence, digital forensics, banking, global affairs, chamber of commerce, consulting, and mobility. And the company sizes also varied from small to medium-sized enterprises to large multinational corporations. This wide variety of interviews allowed for a unique insight into digital trade in Canada and the ASEAN region. With these interviews and our further research, we were able to identify overlooked opportunities to increase economic integration between Canada and the ASEAN. And with that, I'll pass it over to Esther, who will be discussing identified barriers.
Thank you, Shane. I'll be talking about domestic and structural barriers to digital trade with corresponding recommendations, and Edwin will do the same for free trade agreement related barriers. Next slide, please. In our structural assessment of Canada's specific challenges, first we explored Canada's startup culture and looking at Canadian businesses' willingness to explore opportunities in the ASEAN, and we identified the presence of overleveraged incubators and underfunded ventures. Next, we explored the experience of Canadian businesses already operating in ASEAN and identified that there's a shortage of skilled labor to meet demands for technical skills. Zooming out to a macro level assessment of Canada's competitiveness with other nations in the region, we realized that Canada's obscure brand is a disadvantage for Canadian businesses. Going into a deeper analysis, the quote on the screen are the words of a Canadian business executive operating in Singapore, talking about the challenges faced in Canada that he had to overcome in order to be operating in ASEAN now. This quote nicely articulates the theme of overleveraged incubators, which he describes as tech entrepreneurs being sheltered, referencing the incubators across the country create a highly skilled domestic labor force that unfortunately lacks the grit to convert brilliant ideas from the incubators into businesses in the Canadian economy that can compete globally. This is largely due to difficulty securing capital in Canada. Our research showed that securing private investment takes many times the effort only to get a fraction of the funds in comparison to seeking capital abroad. In response, Canadian entrepreneurs fly down to the United States to secure funding, which increases dependency on the US market and in turn disincentivizes Canadian businesses from considering ASEAN despite Canada's attempt via the CPTPP. Moving on to the second barrier, shortage of skilled labor. On the slide, we have a chart showing human capital index of ASEAN nations. For comparison, Canada's index is 0.93, and we can see that Singapore ranks highly as well, but with 0.88, but there's a wide gap between ASEAN countries. A Go Digital ASEAN study by the ASEAN Coordinating Committee on SMEs and the Asia Foundation reported that 40% of ASEAN SMEs lack digital skills and knowledge. This comes as no surprise, therefore, that our interviewees identified having two options in finding labor. Finding skilled labor in Singapore, which is expensive due to steep competition with other foreign companies, or having to outsource from outside ASEAN. This is a high operation cost, especially for Canadian businesses who identify as SMEs as well, and it offsets the traditional benefit of operating abroad, which is lower operation costs. This takes me to the third finding, which is the obscurity of Canada as a brand. The average ASEAN national knows nothing about Canada. Studies show that the brand of a country using Canada in this context is a strong indicator of the likelihood of a buyer to purchase from Canadian companies. It's a strong influencer of the price point for Canadian goods and services in that market. And on a macro level, it affects the enthusiasm for deeper economic integration through trade agreements and partnerships with Canada. Having an obscure brand is therefore costly for Canadian businesses, especially in the midst of foreign competitors with strong brands, all increasing their ties with ASEAN as well. This brings me to the recommendations, of which we have three. One, increasing investment opportunities. Two, increasing academic and research and development partnerships with ASEAN counterparts. And three, strengthening the Canadian brand. We acknowledge that Canada cannot change its convenient neighbor, and having a strong leveraged academic base is crucial. So what needs to be done is to raise the availability of funding to match the incubators. Ramping up funding opportunities and creating a network that connects Canadian investors with entrepreneurs so that Canadian entrepreneurs are not desperately fleeing to the United States lets them consider other viable markets such as the ASEAN. We also emphasize the value of increasing R&D partnerships because they cause transfers of technology and knowledge to the ASEAN knowledge hubs. They increase cultural awareness and information about opportunities available in ASEAN. It reduces the fear of the unknown and also builds Canada's image as an expert, which connects nicely to the third recommendation, which is the strengthening of Canada as a brand. Canada's brand may be obscure, but the few ASEAN nationals who have interacted with Canada state that it is a trusted partner. Trust is a powerful brand, and through campaigns and deliberate advertising, Canada can become a trusted leader and expert in strategic sectors. Investing in campaigns is also a cost-effective option, given the currency advantage between the Canadian dollar and ASEAN currencies. And with that, I invite my colleague, Edwin, to speak to the trade agreement related findings.
Thank you, Esther. First, we've just highlighted the failure of Canada's branding to be understood within the ASEAN region. Concurrently, Canadian businesses fail to effectively use existing agreements in the region itself as well. What does this mean? The spaghetti bowl effect. The spaghetti bowl effect refers to the irony of how an increasing number of free trade agreements have the effect of instead increasing and boosting trade ties. They slow down trade because fewer firms are able to effectively use FTAs given the complexity. We see that intra-regionally within ASEAN, as well as inter-regionally between ASEAN and members outside of its bloc. So FTAs are the bedrock of global trade flows within Southeast Asia. We find that not just Canadian firms, but also ASEAN businesses alike and other firms beyond the bloc have failed to adequately use the free trade agreement provisions. To that extent, A 2010 study discovered that 28% of Asian firms effectively use free trade agreements. Our own findings have been in agreement with or consistent with these findings as well, where just to highlight one example, a global affairs official in an interview remarked a conversation with a large multinational telecom company where they found it very difficult to navigate not just the existing rules and tariffs, rules of origin and provisions, but they're finding it increasingly difficult for exporters under different types of rules, under different agreements, to explore them to the greatest possible extent. This is even found more so with smaller companies because they have less capacity. In order to combat this, we can look simply at improved transparency measures within provisions existing within FTAs. Addition to that, we can look at an awareness campaign of existing digital trade provisions. That is, the expanded use of national digital trade platforms, as seen in Thailand, for example, and also the utilization of the ASEAN Free Trade Area to promote a public-private partnership for the creation of an ASEAN regional digital trade facilitation platform. This can act as a one-stop shop and reduce information burden and costs for businesses and improve business efficiency in general throughout the region for Canadian, ASEAN, and other businesses alike. To look at the spaghetti ball effect in greater, in terms of just an image to clarify, here we see dating back from 2006, 37 agreements that were in effect or under negotiation in Southeast Asia and East Asia. This can simply highlight that not only is this image outdated, but it doesn't also highlight the additional agreements that have come into force since then, and how, as a bloc, it is very difficult for an individual business that wants to work with all ASEAN members to navigate each and every free trade agreement. Interregionally, there are 7 agreements that ASEAN is party to, of which only 2 have digital trade provisions. Please refer to the document to see an explanation for the corresponding numbers. Essentially, as an homage to Southeast Asia, a fan was created which displays these 16 different digital trade provisions, where yes at the center refers to the full inclusion of a digital trade provision or DTP, while no on the outside refers to its non-inclusion. So the closer to the center you are, the more integrated an economy is with this FTA in mind. To that extent, RCEP and the Australia-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement are the only agreements that have DTPs, and Australia in particular, as the only plurilateral agreement, is the most comprehensive to date. I'll be touching on this later on. So another finding we have is very commitments to multilateral trade. To that extent, Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar are the only countries which have made no commitments to digital trade provisions, unlike other ASEAN members which have at least 1 or more agreements. Singapore, the most advanced of these countries at 0.88 on the Human Capital Index from Esther's slide, also has 17 agreements that have digital trade provisions. 17, a feat that is beyond Canada. As a solution to to boost trade ties within ASEAN, rather than dealing with individual bilateral agreements to boost trade, we propose joining agreements already under consideration. We have RCEP and DEPA, and beyond that, with the newly proposed, or actually it's been proposed for a while, CAFTA, the Canada-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, to have a small and medium-sized enterprise orientation. It can use the Australia-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement as a foundation, given it's the most comprehensive one to date. And to emphasize why we think this is the right direction, here are 14 agreements that Canada has with digital trade provisions. And the main takeaway I want you to look at here is that while it's a little bit confusing, Canada has agreed to, has been aggressive in modernizing its existing free trade agreements. It's much easier for Canada to do that than ASEAN as a whole, because it's a consensus building organization. To that effect, the CPTPP and USMCA on the left, which are in red and yellow, they are very similar to RCEP and the Australian agreement. Therefore, and because they are, this overlap can be transferred as a foundation. The only proviso is non-discrimination on digital products, but Canada has agreed to that in other agreements. Moving on to our conclusion.
Thanks, Eddie. So to sum up, our research in the area of digital trade is important today for Canadian businesses as the global economy continues to grow in areas of e-commerce and digital trade, and it is paramount for Canada to seize these benefits. Fostering digital trade collaboration in the ASEAN region can be one of the biggest opportunities for Canada in terms of its trade growth. So for our key takeaways, we want to reiterate our 4 recommendations: improving Canada's national brand by establishing Canada as a science and technology expert, addressing over-leveraged incubators through increasing funding for ventures to lower dependency on the US market, and overcoming the spaghetti bowl effect through transparency awareness, as well as creating national digital trade platforms and trade facilitation programs. And lastly, increasing multilateral trade by joining RCEP and DEPA and further negotiating the CAFTA partnership. Accomplishing these will ease barriers to trade and provide opportunities for Canadian businesses in the ASEAN. And with that, this concludes our presentation, and we would like to welcome any questions or comments at this time. Thank you.
The whole mute trick. Thank you very much, Shane, Edwin, and Esther. And we have some time for questions, about 11 minutes. Please put them in the chat, but we want to start with Kai, excuse me, Kai Ostwald, who was the faculty lead on this project.
Thank you, George, and let me begin by saying this was a really fantastic project. You've provided us a really nice overview of what is a very complex problem. I wonder, you have recommendations that are both domestic focused in terms of restructuring or revitalizing Canada's environment for startups, and internationally focused recommendations around new free trade agreements. If you had a policymaker's ear for 1 minute, where would you suggest that the priority be to make Canada more competitive in digital trade?
I can go first. I would say the priority would lie in the trade agreement, the potential Canada-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement that is currently in negotiations. To highlight some of the barriers that my colleague Edwin highlighted, one of them is the asymmetries between the regulations between ASEAN nations, which has an effect of increasing the cost of operations for Canadian businesses that operate there. So by negotiating a free trade agreement that enables free flow of trading goods, and as well integrates digital trade provisions that that ease the barrier in the difficulty in conducting business across the region, Canadian businesses will be able to harness the gains to trade, not only from one ASEAN country, but simultaneously across the region by finding it easy to transition from domestic operations to setting up in the ASEAN.
Thank you, Kai. Any other questions from you, Kai?
No, thank you for that. I think there are some really interesting questions in the chat box.
Well, let's get to those. One from Rodkinen, which is, I didn't quite understand the connection between Canadian businesses struggling to secure funding in Canada and the dependency on the US and how the ASEAN fits into that picture. Could the CABC team please speak to that some more?
Sure, I'll be happy to. So the connection between securing funding in Canada and the dependency on the US is two-part. First, when Canadian businesses do not have the confidence in their ability to receive ample government and private funding, they have to naturally look elsewhere. The US is a conveniently located option south of the border and has a very similar demographic and similar culture, as well as a huge market with lots of high income earners. So it's a viable and convenient option. And the second part comes back to branding, which was the third barrier that I identified. The country with a strong reputation for a bustling business environment, deep pockets of private investors, and the belief that if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere is the United States. The US's brand has a very powerful pull that attracts entrepreneurs from all around the world, and Canadian entrepreneurs are no exception. So experts and the Canadian talent benefits from the generous Canadian investment in university incubators that are available across the country, only to take this talent and taxpayer investment to the United States, which is how the dependency continues. So in our research, we argue that if the funding is available here to retain Canadian talent, they would have the opportunity to explore options outside of the United States, such as the ASEAN market. And the ASEAN market is extremely attractive because it has twice the US's population. So we're talking double the market size. It has a rapidly growing middle and upper class, and it has a lower operation cost than the United States. So this coupled with a well-designed free trade agreement and digital trade agreement that eases regulatory asymmetries, going back to the first question, and includes enabling digital trade provisions between Canada and ASEAN, will make the ASEAN a much more attractive and lucrative market than the United States is.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to ask a question from Kristen Hopewell, who knows a couple of things about trade apparently. She has two questions. What are the prospects for a Canadian-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement? And if one of you could take that. And then another could take, how would the US respond to Canada joining the RCEP?
All right, I can take that. First, the prospects for a Canada-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement are good. On that note, Canada has been actively engaged since at least 2017 on negotiations looking towards a potential agreement. Actually, this past December, I believe, there was a meeting that moved to accelerate the discussion on improving trade ties between ASEAN and Canada. The problem is that it takes a while to negotiate free trade agreements, especially considering that the only plurilateral agreement, Australia and New Zealand, took several years, and it is comprehensive, very comprehensive. And it is only just a matter of time before that agreement can take effect. But we are sidelined quite a bit by events that happened in Myanmar this past year. So that could slow it down by quite a few years as well. The second question as well, I'm asking about the second question. What was that?
How would the US respond?
Yes, the United States has not quite yet indicated a position. It could be hostile. That is yet to be determined between Canada as a whole through what the Trudeau administration wants. So we can't speak to that. What we can speak to is more so what we believe would best improve Canada's trade ties with ASEAN as a whole. And in effect, RCEP as an agreement, while it is posited in the news to have been a stepping stone for China, it was actually initiated by ASEAN. It is an ASEAN initiated agreement, and to that effect, it as a whole, when put fully into effect, is expected to have a significant boost on trade ties within ASEAN.
Okay, thanks. And our last question will go to Josh, if you could do that. I don't know whether you've been busy typing it into the thing, but you can ask it verbally if you'd prefer.
Yeah, thanks, guys. So for anyone watching, we've been practicing with this group on and off for a couple of weeks, so it's been really fun to see how this project has developed. Great job. I'm wondering about your comments on competitiveness between Canada and the United States, and particularly scale of financing. So you were talking about increasing funding to incubators and branding, and I think that those are great strategies. I guess I'm wondering, Sequoia, the VC fund in the United States, has managed $1.5 trillion in value creation. 200 SPACs have gone public in the first 90 days of 2021. The US is just such a hot market. Is the question that Canada is too cold, or just that the US is too hot and too attractive, regardless of policy positions Canada might take?
Well, to jump in, so looking at it from Canadian businesses going into the ASEAN region outside of the US, yeah, there is such a huge financial market in the US, but from our interviews and our stakeholder interviews that we conducted, successful Canadian companies, whether it be in AI or other areas that went into the ASEAN, once they were able to build these partnerships with specific NGOs, companies and stuff, they were able to receive this backing in the ASEAN market that made it possible for them to be successful, not only just in the ASEAN region, but also wherever else they were conducting business in Canada and the ASEAN. So I think a big thing about going into the ASEAN region is creating these partnerships and these relationships with other companies in that region, and just understanding the culture and how to do things over there. So I think for Canadian companies going there, that's something they should really focus on when looking to expand outside of the Canadian market.
In support of what my colleague Shane just said, the United States is a very strong competitor, a very attractive market, and especially being right beside Canada, juxtaposed to Canada in comparison, does kind of overshadow, especially given that its brand has been built over time, over years, and is recognized worldwide. But I'd like to reemphasize the value of Canada's current image, which is trust. Despite being obscure, trust is a very powerful image to have, and it's one that is very hard to build, especially after being lost over time. So looking at the politics of the United States political relations and diplomacy with other countries, trust has been an aspect of its image that has been eroded over time. And Canada definitely has that as a strategic advantage that it can leverage. And I believe that with implementing the recommendations that we have made so far with regards to targeted branding to ramp up that image, increasing the availability of funding to Canadian businesses so that they are better able to globally compete, as well as putting in place a strong Canada-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement with an ample amount of enabling digital trade provisions. Canada definitely has a lot of ground to grow and catch up, and it doesn't necessarily have to replicate the United States' aggressive general business techniques. Canada definitely has its own image to uphold and to build over time, especially with a region like ASEAN that is also still growing.
Okay, thank you so much, Esther, Shane, and Edwin.